We're glad you've all joined in. We're looking forward to quite an exciting discussion today on a subject that has become increasingly important. We've seen at COP how the issue of the financing of the roadmap has become, financing of the just transition has become a really important subject of discussion. And the work that TIPS has been doing, some of which we'll be talking about today, has been looking at a roadmap on how do we think about the financing and all the pieces of this puzzle that fit together. So we've got a really good lineup of people, and they're going to be presenting some research that we've done as TIPS, and we've also got opening remarks from Rudy Dicks, who's in the presidency, who was at COP26, and we're looking forward to getting his insights. And also, I mean, as we're going down this path, we're seeing the importance of the issues that are going to be shaping financing of this just transition going forward. So not all the pieces of the puzzle are currently in place, but we're looking at what needs to happen in order to make sure that the just transition is effectively financed, and it is indeed a transition that is just. We are always at the back of my minds worried that things go wrong. We have this transition away from coal and decarbonization, and we end up with a transition that is not just, and we leave a number of people behind in terms of employment, livelihoods, and living standards, amongst other things. So there's those threats. There's the threats of climate change itself that is impacting on all of us, and how do we think about that in terms of the finance that's required to be a more resilient society. These are some of the things that we're going to be considering in today's discussion. And we then can hopefully, in the coming months and years, build on all of this work and support a just transition. So let me open up just to our first speaker, who is Rudy Dicks from the presidency. Rudy, I'm not going to give a long introduction of your bio, but if you can turn on your camera, thank you. And then I'm going to turn mine off while you give your opening remarks, and over to you. Thanks, Rudy.
Thank you, Saul, and thanks to the panelists and those who are attending. Someone said to me before I went to COP26 is that, you should be crazy. What did the person say? The person said you should put pencils through your eyes if you want to go to COP26. That's partly correct, because it's a madhouse. That was my first COP meeting. But there's always value in the multilateral system, as we all know. I mean, I think that's very, very important, particularly around the demands that the G77 and of course the basic group, Brazil, South Africa, China, and India, and these were fundamental in, of course, the final outcome of the COP meeting. But I want to talk less about that, because I think the more interesting stuff related to this subject was the stuff that happened on the sideline and pre-COP. And of course, many of you are familiar with the fact that we had entered into a political declaration with the international partner group, US, EU, UK, Germany, and France, on a $8.5 billion package. Now, I have to point it properly, because it's important that in terms of financing deals and how this works, particularly for climate change and for just transition, one has to be quite clear that it's an offer, right? So it's a pledge. It's something that says, I am prepared to commit to this amount of money, and the way that I will give this money is different forms, from grants to concessional finance. Large part of it, of course, is concessional finance. Normal debt, leveraged debt for leveraged finance for additional money in equity markets, or a lot of these things. Now, of course, these are also interesting times, because the one thing that's really challenging for us is, given our fiscal environment, both from a from a sovereign, and if one looks at where most of that money would be going once it's realized, it would be going to Eskom and supporting Eskom's just transition. And of course, you would have seen in that political declaration, there are three areas that the financing deal would look at. First, of course, Eskom, because Eskom, as it is, contributes 41 to 46% of GHG emissions. So it makes common sense that once you introduce, a just transition intervention in Eskom, it has a multiplier effect and it reverberates through the rest of the economy. So immediate reductions in global greenhouse gas emissions and CO2. The second area, of course, is electric vehicles, partly because we have a very competitive, globally competitive, auto sector. And our biggest exporter, of course, is the EU, and the EU is, of course, in the conversation of introducing a border tax adjustment system. And this is going to be quite impactful on us if, for example, something is introduced and we still have internal combustion engines that we're manufacturing, where our biggest market is moving towards EV quite rapidly. So you would have to look at adaptation in that respect. And the third area, of course, for financing is the green hydrogen. But besides that, let's leave that for now. I mean, I think the point about the financing for climate change is quite significant and important. Now, as South Africa, we've set ourselves a very ambitious NDC range, right? In terms of the integrated resource plan, again, there's a lot of debate as to whether this needs to be updated. And I think, in my view, it would have to be significantly updated if we are going to want to fast track, decarbonization of many of our coal-powered fire plants. We would have to have the kind of financing. And this is quite important. And that's why the context of this conversation is quite critical, because for us to be able to achieve that NDC target, or for us to be able to have a more ambitious integrated resource plan, assuming that something gives and it happens, it does require for us to finance it. In the context of South Africa, it's going to be very, very difficult to do that, given our financial constraints to be able to do that. So that's going to be quite an important conversation. And I think the political declaration is, in a sense, CBDR, what's it, common but differential kind of, treatment in the sense that, we need to hold developed countries to contribute their fair share, a disproportionate share, greater share for climate finance as of course, the principles that are committed in the COP26. And this is part of that, I think, which is going to be very, very important going forward. So I also just wanted to say that it's quite critical and why we emphasize this, because given our socioeconomic conditions, and that is, of course, high levels of unemployment, poverty, high levels of inequality, access to access around to electricity and a whole lot of other basic conditions and stuff like that. We have to ensure that when we're financing particular interventions, and let's use those three interventions that the 8.5 billion US would finance, it's critical that it has to take into consideration the impact that it has on those who are going to be affected. So if we are decarbonizing at a rapid rate, you have to understand, of course, that there are in the excess of 80,000 coal workers, and if one has a multiplier effect on that in terms of, or the entire value chain of that, it runs into many thousands more, hundreds of thousands more, as I understand it. And that's quite critical, that a just transition is an important area. Now, financing for a just transition is always tricky, and I must just give you a little bit of insight. I mean, one of the things that when I was leading the negotiations with the international partner group, some of them had said, no, but we want to deal with Eskom per se. We want to make sure that Eskom is able to invest in transmission so that it's able to take on new REs. We want to make sure that we provide additional support for generation capacity and a whole lot of different things around Eskom. And of course, the point about that is Eskom is not something that stands on its own. It's linked to particular communities. It's linked to the way we've designed, of course, our power grid system. It's linked to a coal mine or coal mines, and there's supply chains all over the show. And that was an important conversation to point out to them that, this can't be the case. I mean, when we talk about climate change and a just transition, this is what it means. It means that you need to understand the impact of closing or decarbonizing that it has on workers, communities, young people, women, small businesses that are in the supply chain of Eskom or community. And these are quite critical things to finance. So of course, as you can see, the principle of just transition and making sure that we stick to that is quite critical in that political declaration. So those few those few opening remarks, I think it's important that this kind of conversation and the role that TIPS has played in supporting the development of understanding financing for a just transition, for climate just transition, is going to be quite critical. We're going to move into our next phase of course, fleshing out the details of that, and that's the devil in the detail, right? That's where we think it's going to be quite critical for us to do. But the devil in the detail is also, if one uses the Eskom kind of just energy transition roadmap of using Komati as a case study, as an important example, then we have to get it right if we want to see this cascaded out to other towns that would see similar decarbonization and decommissioning of coal-powered 5 stations, right? So critical area it's going to be a critical area in the next 6 months as we conclude that deal and ensure that the financing is for the right areas that we want, but more so the long-term implications of how we finance, the just transition and ensure that no one is worse affected because of decarbonization or a shift in, from ICE to EV vehicles, etc., and a lot of other areas. That's it. So thanks, Saul, for allowing me to make those introductory remarks, and all the best for the rest of the webinar.
Great. Thanks very much for those opening remarks and setting the scene for what's happening on the ground and some of the difficulties in how we are bringing the just transition financing into the actual support that's required. From what you've said, there's still a bit of a negotiation that's required to resolve how the funds are spent and the detail of how they're allocated to South Africa. So a commitment that still needs to be translated into a detailed plan. So we look forward to engaging with you on that. And also the work that we're presenting today will hopefully add some insights into our own thinking of how it can be taken to communities as well, because one of the key issues that we always need to keep in the back of our mind is that it's not just, as you said, not just financing for Eskom, it's how do we get these funds so that there's financing of new businesses, financing to support the transitioning of existing businesses, and where some businesses or mines will be closing down, how do we support those that are displaced? And there will be, over the next decade, many people displaced, as we know. Thanks very much, Rudy. I'm now going to move over to Sandy. Sandy Lowett is a TIPS research associate, research fellow, and is been leading this project on a transition roadmap, finance transition roadmap. And Sandy's going to be presenting some of the work that we've been doing and initial thinking as we are going down this path of a roadmap. It is a roadmap, and I'm sure she'll explain the conceptualization of why we see it as a roadmap and not the plan. So over to you, Sandy, and thanks very much.
Thanks, Saul. I am providing a very high-level overview of our thinking on the roadmap to date, with a particular focus on creating context for the 4 expert papers that are going to follow on. As some of you may know, in January, we received funding as TIPS to put together a contribution to a just transition finance roadmap. And the very first thing we did was to consult people on the ground to ask them what would be the most useful application of those resources and what the research should focus on. And to a person, everybody basically said, do not do another conceptual abstract roadmap of here is what we need to do over the long term. Rather focus on trying to create some kind of traction and some kind of examples that we can get our teeth into, so we can start answering the questions: what is a just transition project? What are their financing needs? And what can the financial system easily finance? And what will they need to change in order to finance? So the work that we have embarked upon is looking to make a contribution to establish a body of evidence, to actually have data and information as opposed to just ideas. And to do that, we obviously needed to focus the research in a particular location. So we chose Mpumalanga, which is a well-known hotspot in South Africa in terms of where the just transition demand for projects and finance is going to arise in the short run. We basically spoke to a large number of parties to find out if they had projects. And what we said is, do you identify your project as a just transition project? So they were self-identified projects. We had very low entry criteria because we wanted to get as big a sample as possible. So the only projects we upfront excluded were fossil fuel projects and brown projects. We obviously included green projects. We included economic diversification projects that weren't necessarily green. So for example, a project looking at increasing the hospitality industry in Mpumalanga was accepted, even though it wasn't particularly green. Once we had our projects, we had interviews with all the project drivers, and then we got them to complete surveys which had a commercial, financial, and social element to them. And in the end, we ended up with a sample of 26 projects, a nice mix of adaptation, obviously more mitigation projects, and quite a few resilience projects. The projects were at varying levels of development. So some of them were very, very early stage. Some of them were ready to go to market. And our minimum requirement was that there needed to be a specific champion and there needed to be some budget. In other words, they couldn't just be ideas. They needed to be something that could be implemented. So once we had the projects, we needed to put together some kind of framework about how do we approach thinking about financing just transition projects. And we came up with this very simple quadrant framework. On the vertical axis, we put the project ticket price, which is basically the total investment of the project. And the reason we chose that variable is that, speaking to the financial services sector, they said that is their first screening criteria in terms of whether they're interested in looking at a project or not. Then on the horizontal axis, we put what we were interested in, which is basically the just transition. And what we said is we're unlikely in South Africa to have a unified view of what counts as a just transition. So let's embrace this idea that there's a spectrum of just transition ambitions. And those of you who've been following Gaylor Montmasson Claire's work at TIPS will be familiar with this idea of approaches that are relatively low in terms of ambition, and then projects on the right-hand side of the axis which have higher levels of ambition. And just to give you an example, we could say with this one block over here on the left, a lower ambition project would aspire to create decent alternative jobs. On the higher ambition spectrum here with this stack of blocks over here, we could say that a higher ambition project might want to create decent jobs and new livelihoods for communities and reskilling and increased access to services and increased community asset ownership and a whole bunch of other good things. So we're basically saying we can look at a spectrum of ambitions in terms of just transition. And that basically gives us these 4 quadrants. So quadrants 1 and 2 have essentially got lower levels of ambition than quadrants 3 and 4. And similarly, quadrants 2 and 3 have lower ticket prices than quadrants 1 and 4. What we then did is we populated this framework with the information we got from our project samples. And what we came up with, and we were delighted to find, is instead of a scatter of projects, we actually found 4 distinct clusters. And before we discuss those clusters, we made some broad observations about this framework space. The first one is we said that all projects have an important role to play in achieving the just transition. And so we're not going to rank and necessarily prefer higher ambition projects to lower ambition projects. All these projects are going to be important if we're going to meet the challenge that Rudy described in his opening remarks. The second point about the framework, and this is a nuance which we will have to work on in future iterations of the framework, is that some of the projects that have relatively low just transition ambitions in their actual project design have the potential down the line to open up a huge downstream activity base. And those activities downstream will have huge just transition impacts and outcomes. So even though a project may initially present as being lower ambition, it may have high potential down the line to create opportunities for communities and higher employment opportunities. And then the third thing that we found as an overall observation is that while some of the projects are standalone projects, a lot of them are interconnected and independent and present as suites of projects rather than individual projects. Okay, so very quickly, looking at the clusters in more detail. Cluster 1 is essentially the ESCOM projects, and this is what that 131 billion Rand could potentially be applied to. These are generally technology driven and have lower just transition ambition outcomes for the core project, not necessarily for the long-term implications of the project. Cluster 2 projects are relatively low ambition in that they are mainly about job creation, but they have relatively high ticket prices. So we're looking at projects here from about 700 million to about 1.2 billion. And what we're seeing is that these projects are attractive to the private sector, financial sector, but because most of them are based on novel technology, because a lot of these are green projects, we're finding that the institutions are pricing the risk, the technology risk, quite high, and the terms are therefore not particularly attractive to the companies who want to implement the project. So we see a huge role here for DFI de-risking and the use of the Global North's commitments in terms of its Paris Agreement to help with credit enhancement programs related to these projects so that we can get more of them on the ground more quickly. So what we see is that cluster 1 and cluster 2 projects probably can be financed by the existing ecosystem, but we'll probably need some kind of innovation to fast track them and to expand the number of projects in these 2 clusters. When we move on to clusters 3 and 4, we face different problems. Clusters 3 and 4 are categorized by having higher just transition ambitions. And what we find with cluster 3 is that these are small scale projects. These are generally between 5 and 25 million rand. And because of the low ticket price, they are not at all desirable to the existing financial sector, either the public sector or the private sector financing institutions. And so these projects are going to create a huge headache in terms of how we can fund them. And we're going to have to think about how the financial system can change to be able to mainstream finance to these kinds of projects. And importantly, we believe that these are the kinds of projects which are going to be the most dominant cluster of projects moving forward in the just transition. So when we expand away from coal to look at other decarbonizing sectors, we think that these category of projects are going to be the most abundant. So solving for this problem is incredibly important. And then we have cluster 4, which is known as our unicorn cluster. And this is basically a suite of projects which is very high ambition, but also with a very high ticket price of about 6 billion rand collectively. Now, the projects are highly, highly innovative in all senses of the word, and they're going to need very novel financial solutions. And speaking to people in the financial services sector, they are interested in the project, but they don't feel that they have the wherewithal right now to be able to meet those financing needs. So that is a challenge for the roadmap to see how we can make sure that those kinds of projects are funded moving forward. Now, in terms of providing context for the 4 expert papers, which will be presented after this presentation. So that horizontal axis with just transition ambition, it's obviously going to be measured by social indicators. So the first expert piece that we've commissioned, which Ed is going to present, is how do we start thinking about those social indicators? And how can we think about varying levels of ambition in relation to those specific indicators? The second piece of work we commissioned is the work that Nicole will present on financial sector awareness, communication and understanding of just transition funding challenges. And this is basically having a look at how well does the existing community understand what we're trying to achieve with just transition finance? To what extent do they buy in? And what do they see as the key barriers that are preventing them either understanding more or becoming more engaged with actual financing on the ground? Then our third expert paper was basically having a look at cluster 3 and 4 projects and saying, we know that there are financing gaps and we know there are financing challenges for these 2 clusters. What are the technical options that we could think about in terms of funding those 2 gaps? And that is the work that Chantel has done through Rabia Transitions that she'll be reporting on. And then finally, as I said, these cluster 3 projects are going to be very important as we expand decarbonization through more sectors than just the coal sector. And we think these are going to be the norm in terms of just transition projects. We also know that they are particularly difficult for the financial services sector to fund. So the 4th paper, which we commissioned from Fumani from Knowledge Pele, basically starts looking at the characteristics of these smaller community scale projects and thinking about how can we think about scale and increasing scale or resolving the financing challenge of getting funds to these kinds of projects. Then I've just got 2 more slides. I'm going back to the broad roadmap. essentially what we see with this purple line is we've applied the purple line to that existing framework. And we've said that these clusters 1 and 2, these low and medium just transition ambition projects, can probably be financed by the existing financial ecosystem. So what our just transition finance roadmap needs to do is it needs to look at unlocking increased flows into those kinds of projects. And the political declaration at COP was obviously one of those examples. On the right-hand side of the dotted line, we've basically said these more ambitious projects, clusters 3 and 4, are not going to easily be funded by the existing financial system. So that system is going to have to undergo a system level change. And we're going to have to build a new financial ecosystem, which is systemically able to support just transition fund mobilization and deployment. So going back to the transition roadmap, we're also going to need activities which support that system level change. So what that's telling us is the roadmap has to have a dual agenda, working with the existing system to increase the mobilization of just transition funding within the current limits of the system, and moving towards an improved system which will systemically support all just transition projects. And then just as a final note in terms of how we are structuring the paper that we're presenting, what we've done is on the right-hand side here, we've put together a 2050 vision of what this wonderful, perfect future South African financial ecosystem would look like if it was perfectly aligned to government climate and social development policy goals, including all the just transition goals. So this would be our long-term utopia that we would like to reach. We also now have information on what is the current gap to finance just transition projects as they are currently coming online in South Africa, in Mpumalanga at the moment. And so what we're actually writing up for the roadmap is a 4-year plan, which is going to say, how do we start planning to meet this gap and to make progress in terms of making sure these projects in the short run can receive funding? And simultaneously, how, by answering these questions, do we move towards this 2050 vision? We don't want to do things in the short run that are not going to create the building blocks for achieving the 2050 vision. So in the roadmap, we're trying to balance and to learn from the bottom up to influence how we create the long-term vision for the roadmap. Thanks, Saul. I'll end there.
Thanks very much, Sandy. Okay, so there's a lot of moving parts that you've presented, and we're going to be unpacking each of those moving parts as we go through this morning's seminar. What I would suggest is, rather than having discussion on each presentation, is that we take the series of presentations and then we open it up to a panel discussion and questions. We have set up the meeting as a big meeting format, so people can interact you know, once we've had the presentations. There's also the chat group. So if you want to add your comments along the way, please feel free to do so. And if you have questions that you would like to pose to any of the presenters, please do so. Let me then move on to our next presentation or presenter. And there we have Ed O'Keefe from Synergy Global, and he's going to be talking about that first paper that Sandy had pointed to in her third last slide, which is around the social indicators for investments in just transition, and how we start thinking about that so that it makes sense. Yeah, just to say to everyone that we will be making all the presentations and the papers and a video of this session available on the TIPS website. So it should be uploaded in the next day or two. We'll have all of the presentations and YouTube clip loaded up. as well as the papers that have been presented. The roadmap that Sandy's working on will take a little bit longer. We'll probably have that out early in the new year, but we will have the presentation she's made available on the TIPS website, and that's tips.org.za if you're not familiar with it. Okay, Ed, over to you to present your paper. Thanks.
Great, thanks, Saul. Morning, everyone. As Saul and Sandy said, the work that we did was developing an initial framework of social indicators for investment in a just transition. And just to note that it's a very initial framework, and we really see this as a sort of a starting point to prompt discussion and reflection and development from there. So as Sandy said, really just the lack of a completely clear, consistent and unifying framework for talking about what is or isn't a just transition project is really holding back and impeding investor decision making, and the real need is to try and unlock that financing. So what we're doing was looking at developing an initial indication of a set of consistent, comprehensive and transparent social indicators to help sort of define and measure the social outcomes that you'd be looking for on a just transition project. So we used a bunch of design criteria for developing that framework. Firstly, that it was gap oriented, so it was very much focused on the difference between what an unjust transition would be and what a just transition would be. So really looking at that change in social indicators from an unjust transition to a just transition. That it was focused on impacted people, not only potentially those 80,000 coal workers that Rudy talked about, but that wider value chain as well, the workers affected by that wider value chain, and communities affected by that. As well as a specific focus on vulnerable groups, people who are particularly vulnerable to the negative impacts of the energy transition. It was evidence-based, so it was very much grounded in that work around Mpumalanga, all the existing research, as well as sort of some of our own work in Mpumalanga in that area, as well as experience more widely on just transition and closure of particularly coal projects as well. Multi-level, so just looking at those different dimensions from procedural, distributional and transformational outcomes that we're looking for, and systemic, so we're looking at systemic interventions in order to achieve a just transition. As we said, it's all very interconnected, really focusing on those key points in those systems that would have potentially ripple effects elsewhere, and that allows us to maybe sort of focus on some of the key indicators. And incentivizing investment diversity, as Sandy said, there's a need for a sort of diverse portfolio of investment in lots of different shapes and forms, and encouraging different pathways and different levels of ambition. All of them are equally important, so we didn't want to sort of just focus on particular areas. And then finally, aligned with other frameworks in terms of sort of national frameworks, but also aligned with our other financing interventions as well. So we're able to join the dots. So let's sort of take you through the thinking, the process that we went through. The first big bit of work was really mapping the system and using Mpumalanga as the example. We really looked at what's the current state of play there in terms of the energy system and the links to social indicators there. And then what would happen in an unjust transition? So if there were no interventions at all, what are the potential impacts there? And then imagining that sort of ideal system as well in a just transition, what would be required and what we'll be looking for in terms of those social indicators. And that really helped us focus on, well, firstly, it sort of really unpacked the complexity and the interlinkage of what the effects that an energy transition would have, but also helped us identify on sort of key areas in that system that you need to focus on to make sure that you move from an unjust transition scenario to a just transition scenario. So those diagrams at the below is sort of our thinking, you know, that where we mapped out some of the systems and the interconnections between those social issues. And from mapping that out, we came out with some consistent categories of indicators. So, you know, in many ways, this is not rocket science. It's sort of fairly obvious stuff. So the first one is obviously jobs and skills. Second area is around the economy and economic diversification. Third area around infrastructure and services, including social services. Fourth area around environment, water and land. And then a fifth area around empowerment and more sort of the procedural side and empowering communities in that. Within each of those categories, we identified some subcategories of issues. So within jobs and skills, for instance, looking at secure jobs, so the security of the jobs, the timing of those access to jobs as well. So making sure that there was access to new jobs as people lost their jobs. Skilled jobs, so access to jobs at a skill level that was consistent with the skills of workers affected by the transition. Access to worker health benefits came out as a key issue, and skills development as well. So sort of fairly kind of big but obvious buckets. And we similarly broke down the other areas into some of those key areas, which I won't take you through in detail now. The other thing that really came out as we were mapping out the systems was that there were really three different big buckets of sort of temporal horizons, timing issues of different types of social indicators that we need to focus on in terms of having an impact on just transition. And you see, we've sort of visualized this in the chart here. So the first bucket of indicators were really around mitigation. So mitigation, minimizing the negative impacts, particularly of coal closures, but other energy transition closures, so that it was ensuring a timely, fair and secure redundancy packages, reskilling, supply chain transition support. So really just investments to try and minimize those immediate negative impacts, particularly driven by job losses. The second time horizon is really around indicators that show restoration of that. So restoring those social outcomes that have been affected by the negative impacts. So restoring, but blind to whether those are green or non-green impacts. So simply providing jobs through wider economic diversification, regardless of whether they're green jobs or not. And then the third area is really getting into that higher ambition of just transition. So really creating jobs which are green in the green economy, but also transformation as well. So addressing some of those systemic issues and transformational issues. And what you can see in those graphs is the need to, in terms of mitigation, is to sort of increase and extend the impacts that you have on mitigation, so that they're, in a way, those negative impacts are delayed and minimized as much as possible. And increasing and accelerating investments that help restore impacts. So sort of basically things like creating new jobs and alternative jobs as quickly and as soon as possible. And similarly with the transformation, making sure that green jobs are created, transformational impacts are created as soon as possible. So the key thing here is that what can potentially happen is those investments are not aligned in terms of timing, that there may be investments in green energy, green jobs, but they're not timed in sync with the loss of jobs as well. So the key thing here is to really bring out syncing and good alignment of those different investments as well. And also recognizing that there'll probably be different types of investment and different investors interested in those three different time horizons. And that's how we've really structured the social indicator framework. Another thing to note on the indicators is really some sort of screening criteria to really help focus it. So to help really focus, to ensure that investments are genuinely just transition projects. So first, a really simple question is the investment positively or negatively impacting upon workers and communities adversely affected? So it's a really obvious question, but forcing investments to sort of answer that question and develop it, and thinking through what's the scale of the geography of investment, when will the impacts occur, how will the investment lead to those envisaged impacts, and what's the level of confidence. So really making sure that there's a clear, I guess, theory of change in terms of how an investment is going to lead to those intended social outcomes, so that investments can't really just sort of tick the box. There's got to be a real kind of a coherent line of thinking to say, actually, how is this investment genuinely and likely going to lead to those social outcomes that we've identified. The other sort of thing in the background that we talked about was the need for investments to be aware of the enabling environment as well. So the investments themselves may not have an impact on the enabling environment, but it really does help understand the likelihood that these social outcomes will be needed. And these different enabling environment factors will vary from context to context, even kind of district to district, or even community to community in some cases in Mpumalanga. But really making sure that investments are aware of this. So we sort of put them into various different buckets in terms of sort of planning. So what's the planning environment for just transition in that area? What's the governance situation that investment is happening? What's the wider business investment economy that's occurring, and what's the sort of social context that's happening? Our experience from just transition in different areas is that these enabling environments are absolutely critical to the success or otherwise of investment. So it's really important that this comes out in the framework, or it sort of almost sits behind it as an important aspect to make sure that it's coherent. Just to take you through one example of one of the indicators, and I'll show this sort of more detailed framework briefly afterwards, but we've just taken out one example to give you a sense of how it's structured. So as you see, we've used those categories and job category, so those sort of high level categories and then subcategories. We're showing here one of the subcategories around skills development. So it's structured around that. And then for each of those categories, we've basically got one indicator for each of the three temporal horizons. So social indicator for mitigation on skills development, one that's focused on restoration, and one that's focused on transformation. So investments should be able to indicate to what extent they'll have an impact on any of those social indicators, and it may focus on one of those temporal horizons more or not. The indicators are worded so there's a sort of direction of change from the current situation to just transition in. So in this case, the wording is around increased access to skills development in different shapes and forms. And this key difference between the mitigation, restoration, and transformation in this case is mitigation is around in-work skills development. So skills development whilst people are still in work before they've been made redundant as a result of energy transition impacts. Restoration is around skills development in general. So this may be sort of separate to being in work, but skills development in any areas that are relevant. And then for transformation, the focus is on skills development that's relative to the sustainable economy or the green economy for workers, so that workers are able to transition from carbon intensive economy to green or green economy. So the other things just to note is the wording is the focus is specifically on workers adversely affected by transition. So sort of locking in that requirement for investments to demonstrate that impact. And then also in key areas looking at particular vulnerabilities. The wording's also been aligned so that it ties up with things like the National Development Plan, BBBE language, SDGs, the IRIS Plus metrics for impact investing and the EU transition fund. So the wording sort of does neatly align and the structure does neatly align with other frameworks. So I'm just going to flash up on screen there very briefly each of those indicator frameworks. So you'll see the sort of structure that I talked you through, very similar model for working out those indicators for those other different areas. So this is the one for jobs and skills, probably the biggest one. A set of indicators around the economy, so for business support, for community livelihoods and a sustainable economy. Infrastructure and skills, so revenues to government, infrastructure, access to energy, mental health, healthcare, and childcare. Childcare actually came out as a really strong part of just transition in order to enable, particularly in order to enable workers. And then ones around land use and environment and water. And finally, issues around empowerment, so access to information and accountability, participation in decision-making processes related to just transition, and finally ownership as well, so ownership in that economy as well. So those are the social indicators. And Saul, back to you. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Ed. I think that gives us a lot of detail that you've gone into. It's you've obviously done a lot of work thinking through these issues, and the challenge then becomes, how do we put it into that tiny little graph that Sandy's got? But we're going to have to build on all of this work so that we're able to take it forward and use these indicators in a way that helps us to ensure that as we building those stepping stones on that that graph, that we're building our understanding of all of those areas, and how we make sure that the implications of the transition are felt by those who are impacted and made vulnerable by it. Let me move over to our next speaker. Thanks very much, Ed. We're going to move to Nicole Martins, who is from Martins Impact Advisory, and she is going to be talking about the next part of that chart that Sandy had put up, which is on the financial stakeholder communication, outreach, and awareness, and starts to become important, because what we're talking about is a roadmap where people are going to need to change and change behavior, change how they approach the finance sector, and change their own products and services. So some of these things, as Sandy has indicated, require tweaking. Some of them require system level change. So a key engagement and understanding how we start thinking about these things is of critical importance if we want to get this roadmap right and get to that end state vision that we're looking at. Over to you, Nicole. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Saul, and thanks everyone for joining us today. It's exciting to take you through the findings of this particular paper, and very excited to think about how it will fit into the broader Just Transition Finance roadmap. A reminder that this presentation is really just a high-level overview of some of the key findings, but we'd highly recommend that you read these reports and read the finance roadmap in its entirety to get a better sense of the depth of the research. As was mentioned, my name is Nicole Martins from Martins Impact Advisory, and I'm going to take you through the paper that we did, specifically speaking with financiers, both local and international financiers, to get a sense from them around what is it like on the ground in reality trying to finance these projects? So what is their understanding of the projects and the need for the financing? What is their involvement in these projects, and what do they perceive as some of the constraints or the challenges that they are facing in trying to get more involved in this kind of financing? If you'd like more detail around sort of who we spoke to, the range of financiers we spoke to, that's all in the paper itself, so I highly recommend that you check that out. Just as a quick introduction, but Sandy's already covered and sort of covered sort of the main things. We were really focused in this project on stress testing some of TIPS's findings from the theoretical research that had been done. So Sandy had mentioned we wanted something really practical. We wanted to move away from abstract thinking. And so we focused on engaging with stakeholders and getting first-hand accounts of what is the experience of financiers who are trying to get involved or are involved in this particular space. And the idea behind that was to try and get really practical recommendations for changes that we could make at a systemic level so that we can unlock that financing that Sandy had spoken about. Again, this presentation is really looking at just the high-level key findings, but there's a lot in there that we'd highly recommend you have a look at, especially if you're in the finance space. We'd love to get your thoughts on whether that accurately captures your own experience as well. So the first thing is obviously this kind of research raises a lot of questions, right, when you're engaging with financiers. And the first one that stuck out very clearly, and it's echoed the work that Sandy was talking about as well, is the idea of what even is this just transition? So a lot of the conversations that we had with investors, that, with the financiers, it started with them trying to explain what they understand when they talk about the concept of a just transition. And what I've got on each slide is just a quote from someone that we spoke to. And this one really captures the core of the problem, which is this idea that the intention is there. We'd love to get more involved in this just transition, if only someone could just tell us what that means. So there was a lot of confusion around what exactly constitutes a just transition project. When we're talking about the just transition, are we talking specifically about the just energy transition, or is it something more broad? Are we talking, when we say just, what do we mean by just? Justice for who? At what scale? There's a lot of conflation by financiers of the just transition finance with climate finance, sustainable finance, responsible investment, green bonds. There's a lot of muddying of the waters that's taking place. And so a lot of the investors that we spoke to, some of them are very comfortable with their own definition of the just transition. But what really came out very strongly was that there's a need for a very clear definition around what do we as a market consider to be a just transition project, so that we can accurately classify just transition financing. And there was a loud call from everyone we spoke to around the need for, specifically from policymakers, to be very clear on what do we consider in alignment with our national ambitions to be a just transition aligned project, so that financiers are very clear on what they would be contributing to. That's the first thing. It's just a definitional issue. What is this just transition? How can we make this clearer? So Sandy had mentioned earlier about this challenge that exists in trying to get one single unifying definition and maybe having to think about it on a spectrum. Even something like that is helpful for investors to get a sense of, do I consider this just transition financing or not? Next really was around more of a sort of policy issue. There was a lot of confusion around what South Africa's position actually is on the just transition. And from an investor or financier perspective, this lack of clarity was translating into, as Sandy had mentioned, higher pricing of risk, right? So there was, from an investment standpoint, uncertainty is risky and risky is expensive. And so there was a call there that policymakers from a national level should have a much clearer ambition and strategy. And I think it's important to note here that this work was conducted before we had officially submitted our revised NDCs and our net zero by 2050 commitment. So that's probably helped a little bit in that sense. And there was also a call to maybe set up some sort of special entity focused exclusively on financing the transition, so that if you were interested in getting involved in this, you could go to one place and you knew that that financing would then make it to the right kinds of projects toward the overall national ambition. So that was a big challenge that a lot of investors noted, is that there isn't really a clear position nationally, and so they aren't really sure what are they supposed to be aiming toward. On that, it's important to note that obviously the range of views expressed by financiers across the spectrum vary. So for some, this was a major stumbling block for them. They didn't want to get going without knowing that what they were contributing toward was aligned to the national agenda. And on the other, there were some investors who said, look, we've never had policy certainty before, and it's never stopped us before. So it really depends. I think for some of the investors, it's a genuine constraint, and for some, it's an excuse not to move. But again, for more detail on how we unpack that, highly encourage you to read the full report, or we can touch on it in the panel discussion. The third thing is an interesting problem that's often cited when it comes to not just transition finance, but also climate finance or sustainable finance, green finance in general, and that's this problem of pipeline. So you'll often hear investors say that the problem is not the finance, we have the finance. Some of the investors we spoke to said that they are literally falling over themselves to provide climate finance and just transition finance, but there's just no projects, which was always interesting, especially because there's been so much talk about these things. So, you know, echoing back to Rudy's opening remarks around, there's this pledge, there's this commitment, there's an idea, but that's not a deal. That's not a proper investment yet that investors can engage with, that they can start to throw money at right now. And I think a lot of that uncertainty and maybe the delay in the process is reflected in this understanding that there are no projects. What's important to note is that when we go to the next issue, you'll see that sometimes what's perceived as a problem of pipeline is actually a problem of institutional frameworks and the tools that we're using to assess project viability. So we'll talk about that in the next slide. But really, from this, what we realize is that what would be really helpful actually is investing more in improving the capacity and the competence of policymakers and investors and project developers to get these projects, not just to design them appropriately and make sure that they are meeting the criteria that they need to, but in order for them to be able to identify these projects if they don't come in the exact packaging that they might expect. When we spoke to some of the financiers, there was a bit of a utopian vision about what a just transition project should be, that it should be a mega project, something like the transformation of ESCOM, that it should tick all the boxes and it should not just contribute to the just transition, but solve it in one go. And as Sandy pointed out, while there are definitely going to be some of those mega projects that are very necessary and very impactful and have massive ticket sizes, there are equally very important and multiple smaller in terms of ticket size and impact, but very ambitious transition projects that will need to be financed. And so the problem is not necessarily that the projects don't exist, but that they don't the frameworks that we've got together. So that's also something to consider. There was also talk of maybe developing specialized vehicles for project incubation and aggregation that might help to actually build up this pipeline. And there was a lot about, what about working with our existing, for us to transition, we need to in business. But there was also, so it's going to require that we engage with our existing portfolios to see how can we refinance and provide guidance for addressing the transition with the investments in which we are already invested. And then the next one, which I think from my side at least personally was most interesting, was really this idea about, do we have the right tools for the job? And this quote, I think, from one of our interviewees was really just perfect, where they were talking about the mental leap that needs to take place between our intention and the reality of how things work. And specifically what they were talking about there is that while many investors will talk about how they do support the just transition and they would love to get involved in just transition financing, in reality, even if the perfect project came to their desks today, the way that their organizations are set up the frameworks that they use to calculate their risk-adjusted returns, the frameworks that they use to assess the viability of investment are simply not designed to assess or to favorably assess innovative projects, out-of-the-box thinking, these new things. Sandy had mentioned the idea of something like novel technologies. So even though the intention is there to support these, we understand that what we need is a different way of investing, is a different way of doing business, is a different kind of project, but we're just not set up. The evolution of our systems and our frameworks has not kept pace. And so even though we want to support these things, our internal frameworks are just not set up for that. Everything from incentive structures to reporting frameworks and benchmarks, project valuation frameworks are just not designed in order for us to actually support these kinds of projects. So there's a lot of work and introspection that the financial services sector needs to do in that front, to get their own houses in order to actually support the stated intention that they have. And then, of course, because a lot of these projects are going to require blended finance, it was raised a number of times that public sector financing frameworks like the PFMA are not necessarily fit for purpose for this, right? So you have an outcomes-based vehicle, but the framework that's used for the financing from the public sector is not based on that. You know, they have to disperse sort of returns or payments at specific intervals, regardless of outcome. And so there's a bit of a mismatch there. So there's a lot we need to do in terms of if we've got our stated intention, there's a lot of work we need to do about how do we, in practice, make that a reality? How do we create an enabling environment to action that intention? Then another interesting thing that came up was the idea of reputational risk. So while one might think that in certain markets, particularly in the EU and the US, there's a lot of research, and again, you know, the point of this was to test some of the theoretical findings, was that there's a lot of research that suggests that the benefit for this market is to be a first mover. It lies in being a first mover and being proactive in taking that first step in being the first financier to offer green or just transitional sustainable finance projects. What we found in engagements with financiers in this market is that the South African market is comparatively small and illiquid. It's very competitive, and a lot of the financiers fear being a first mover because of a number of things. The first is that they don't want to be seen as being too off trend, so being seen to be off the benchmark. They don't want to be accused of greenwashing. So let's say they do go ahead with something, they call it a just transition financing vehicle. It's the best that they can do today with what they know now. And when they look again, they're accused of greenwashing because actually they could be doing more, or their understanding wasn't quite there, or, you know, the project creates 1,000 jobs, but actually could create 10,000 and they didn't see that opportunity. And so then they're perceived as being insincere in their intention. So a lot of the investors we spoke to said that they're involved in this kind of projects, or projects that they think would be considered to be aligned with just transition financing, but they would never outwardly call them that. They would never state that that was what they were doing for fear of reputational damage. One of the recommendations we have from there is around the improvement of social safety net provision by public sector bodies, so that investors are not seen to be responsible for the solving of all social ills. You know, if there is going to be, we've talked about this, you know, in the transition, that there are going to be some losers. We've spoken about, Ed was talking about the alignment of the timing, for example, of job creation. Investors need to know that they are not going to be held responsible for making sure that that timing works, so that they can go ahead and support these projects, they can invest in them, and not have, you know, angry communities come after them as the financiers because of a lack of appropriate social safety nets for those that don't win in that transaction. There was also a call for public confirmation by policymakers of the roles and responsibilities of public versus private sector stakeholder groups. So can we just be clear on who is responsible for what, so that financiers can move, investors can move comfortably, do what it is that they do without worrying that they're going to be held responsible for something that's not actually within their ambit. And then, of course, the increased use of appropriately designed blended finance vehicles, so that governments can get involved as a risk mitigator, which is really the most appropriate place for them to play. And then the last thing, which was really interesting as well, is that every single interviewee that we spoke to acknowledged the need for collaboration. So there was a very clear understanding that solving for this problem, this highly complex and interconnected problem, will require collaboration at a scale that we've never before seen. And it would be collaboration between investors, so across the private sector, but then also between private and public sector financiers, project developers, policymakers, DFIs, all coming together to design specific vehicles that can solve these problems. So while everyone acknowledged that this was necessary, less than half of the people that we spoke to were willing to take that first step and actually participate in any kind of collaborative engagement without some sort of guarantee or push. And I think it's a reflection of a past experience that maybe they've not had great success with that before. And so for that, the recommendation is really around constructive, solution-focused collaboration between stakeholders across the spectrum. Again, we say, in the paper, there's a lot more detail, but when we talk about specifically looking at what does this mean for communication, awareness, and outreach, just a couple of key notes to wrap up is really around communication needs to be, obviously, there needs to be more of it, and it needs to be more effective. From policymakers, we need to be clear and consistent about our national ambition, especially in our communications with international investors who don't have the local context, against to balance what they read in the papers and what they hear in official statements. And remember that any confusion, any uncertainty is perceived as increased risk, which makes the investment unaffordable. And then from investors, we need to be comfortable and confident to be very clear on what are our house views, what are our strategies. When we're involved in these kinds of projects, let's say so, let's be comfortable to acknowledge that and also acknowledge where we are on this journey. If we're experiencing some of these constraints or challenges, let's take that up with the relevant authority rather than sort of sitting and stewing on it and using it as an excuse not to move. When it comes to awareness, there's a great deal of awareness to be raised around, as we mentioned, some of the core definitional and sort of basic foundational concepts. But there's also a lot of work to do around increasing competence around developing these projects, developing these vehicles, looking inward at how do we change our frameworks and identifying potential when it doesn't come in that perfect sort of package. And then getting everyone onto the same page when you talk about the realities involved in this kind of thing. So not just theoretically, what would it look like, but in reality, it's going to be messy. It's not always going to be some utopian mega project that you just dive into. And then really around outreach is to focus on distributing clear communication and consistent communication on the key issues so that everyone is on the same page when it comes to this. Just as a final thought, one of the things that did come up is that despite all of these perceived challenges and constraints, what was overwhelmingly clear in the engagement with these investors was that there was nothing stopping any investor from getting started right now. They might be limited in terms of the scale and the depth that they might want to engage, but there's no reason why they couldn't start with something right now. And so that's very encouraging for us, and hope that it would be something that would help the transition finance roadmap to get some traction and for these projects to start unlocking some finance. So that's a high level whirlwind of a run through. Happy to take questions in the panel discussion as well. Saul, back over to you.
Great. Thanks very much, Nicole. I think that gives us a lot of insights into what people are saying and thinking, but also some key areas that need to be resolved as we're going through the roadmap. There's a lot of testing, putting toes in the water, but if we're going to have a successful move to a future that is sustainable, there's going to have to be commitments from the private sector and in the institutional governance arrangements. So how do we think about the policy framework that oversees the financial sector, that takes cognizance of the fact that the planet will burn if we don't decarbonize, and we're already seeing with the adverse weather patterns, particularly in South Africa, but also the rest of the world are experiencing it, that the finance sector does need to come on board, and risk mitigation discussions at board level need to include these issues and how they onboard it in terms of finance patterns. So there's a lot of work to be done, but it sounds like there's been already some thought as to how they could start getting involved, changing their approach. But yeah, we still have a way to go on that. But thanks very much. And it really does take us into the depth of understanding that we require as we're building this roadmap and going down the pathway of a just transition. It also neatly fits into the next presentation that Chantel's going to make. So Chantel Naidu, who is with Rabia Transition, is going to be presenting her work on just transition project needs and financial developments. And we'll talk to some of how we can take that understanding that Nicole has presented to the next level. So I'm looking forward to your input. Thanks, Chantel. Over to you.
Thank you, Saul. And thank you to the TIPS team also for the invitation to be part of this very exciting journey that TIPS has started the country on. I think already TIPS started last year with a series of dialogues, and I think that's really contributed just to the communication Nicole was speaking about, the levels of awareness. So I think you're right. The presentation does fit very neatly into the prior two, and what was really exciting for me listening to what Ed and Nicole mentioned was specifically on Ed's side, speaking about the temporal ranges of the indicators of mitigation, restoration, and transformation, that there's investment needed over time. And what I really liked about Nicole's comments is around the right tools and the pipelines, which really stood out for me as something that we went a little bit deeper into this particular piece on better understanding the financing needs of the projects focused on just transitions, the instruments we currently have available, and then what do these findings imply for the roadmap. So just to give a flavor of the insight sources that we took, it was largely a desktop exercise in terms of reviewing project level information, some conversations with project developers, but both building on the work that Sandy has already done in the other projects. Also, Nicole and I had spoken quite a bit also on some of the early findings that she was picking up. And then we did a scoping of financing instruments currently available in SA. What was fascinating for me just in this exercise was that this work actually fits in very interestingly at a global level to Paris Agreement 2015 generally, and that's the specific Article 21C, which speaks to and recognizes the need that the financial ecosystem has to transition. It speaks to make finance flows consistent with the low emission and climate resilient development pathway. And within that, it recognizes justice, it recognizes equity, and it recognizes transition. So this work is very much, in as much as it's new in South Africa, it's envisaged that the system itself needs to change. So I'll start you off with looking at our project. Why did we focus on the project needs? And as Sandy said, we went deeper into the more higher ambition level projects. But maybe just let's think about projects for a moment, and that it's actually the main intervention between how those that control and own finance flows, so our financial ecosystem, and those that need finance, our projects, the programs, the plans, all of that, how they actually interact. And through projects is that channel in which we're going to exchange resources in order to pursue the just transition vision. So just putting it out was a statement that we made, and both Sandy and I got quite excited about it when we clicked on this sort of narrative. So if you consider that the money is the bits that flow in between that, but what stands behind this is really important to understand. And what stands behind that simple narrative is that at the level of interventions on the right of the screen, there is a whole host of interactions happening. And as we heard from Nicole, the narratives of project plan, policy plans, consistency of communication, which translates into program design, that feeds into our economy and the processes of change, but also the way our financial intermediaries embedded in the financial system. What are their priorities? What are their incentives? What are their constraints? And it's not only at the level of the South African banks and pension funds and other intermediaries. They have influences acting upon them in terms of national, but international, and then broader priorities and regulations. And together, it's a dance, but sometimes it's both partners are not listening to the same tune, perhaps. But effectively, the dance between the finance sector And the projects which are intended to contribute to this groundswell of, I guess, temporal shifts that Ed mapped out so nicely between mitigation, restoration, and transformation. So the premise of this piece of work that we did was that the characteristics of this transition process should inform the financial response. What kind of innovations flow from this? What kind of issues arise from this journey? So a simple point that others have made, but I just go a little bit deeper into it in this, is that Sandy makes in her early research the point about ambition as being the scale, the y-axis of social justice and indications. And yes, the financial sector preference is to have certain ticket sizes and where that defines, but the level of ambition is really critical. And in terms of looking at, if you look at the screen, we've got on the one spectrum fairly conventional funding, which is agnostic in terms of brown and green dimensions, and as it moves along, and this was quite educational for me in terms of a discovery when we look deep into those suite of projects that were looking at much more ambitious outcomes, that there was a clear aspect of more on this side of the scale. There was a clear shift, not just sustainability as we understand it, but the aspect of restoration, which Ed also mentioned, but going beyond restoration was this element of regeneration, looking at the communities where the transition effects were most evident, and asking questions about how do you replace livelihoods and economic activity, creating independence and interdependence amongst the activities that are happening there. And this fundamental thinking about the project design or the intervention design sort of helps, I observed, it helped to inform the quality of the projects that were coming through that journey. And regeneration speaks to the renewal of those systems rather than trying to maintain what was already there. And I think Saul also mentioned that in his earlier intervention. It was not just about fixing, what needed to be fixed as a result of vulnerability, but actually going much further, not doing harm, but actually doing better, given the fact that we're already working with an unjust base. So we also had good interactions with two sets of project developers, and the one was specifically around large just energy transition focused projects, but then just broadly on the just transition it's as a broader concept. And of course, a lot of national activities focused on the just energy aspect, which is clearly important, but it's not the only aspect, and we do need to think broader about it. So we can quickly go through some of the comparisons, and they're quite similar, actually, to be honest. The just energy speaks to more immediate scenario policy-based evidence, whereas for the higher ambition projects, the science and nature-based evidence dimensions seem to take a higher priority. Aspects around economic, social, and ecological dimensions most certainly featured. But on the level of just energy projects, one of the prescriptive criteria was that in the project design was, can we get funding or can't we? Was almost, well, we will design based on the access to funding we can have. The narrative for the higher ambition projects was a little different in the sense that funding was certainly there as we're going to need funding, but it wasn't seen as if we don't get funding, we can't do this project. It was what quality of projects do we need to deliver the specific regenerative ambitious outcomes we need in that community. And then the conversation was what forms of finance is needed to make that now happen. So it was just a very slight nuance, but the one was almost a barrier or prerequisite to defining what projects we can do, whereas the other was we'll design the projects as is needed and then make sure we can figure out where the funding will come afterwards. On the smaller scale projects as well, on the, as Sandy described, cluster 3 and 4, governance, transparency, and those aspects were essential, as was on the just energy side also. So maybe what I speak to a little bit, Sandy mentioned it, as did Nicole and Ed, about the interdependency of projects. So this is just one of the project developers that we had spoken to, which gave us access to some of their info about how were they designing projects in a way to not make this make it abstract. But they would start out with almost, if there was an issue around sort of water security in a particular area, they would build out the different dimensions of aspects of a biodiversity aspect, an energy aspect, an agricultural aspect, to start creating a degree of livelihoods. And that would then determine in a way the kind of quality and project needs that then can flow on, but also the more advanced projects that need to happen. So what was fascinating for me in these higher ambition projects, and I'm not even sure I would call it higher ambition projects, but maybe it's more deeper forms of transition rather than the restorative, perhaps transformative dimension, as Ed described, is that there was a deliberate shift in systemic conditions that needed to happen, and that there were many factors outside the control of those vulnerable stakeholders. But critical from a finance point of view is the fact that these projects were really essential and that they were time sensitive. There were things that had to happen specifically linked to ecological, social, and economic realities linked to climate, and also appreciating that those climate vulnerabilities are intensifying and only getting worse. So in as much as there are prerequisites of how finance operates, there's also the inevitability and essential nature of what needs to be financed at a particular point in time. And again, just to speak to the interdependence, where one is the prerequisite for the other, what does that then mean from a bank, from a financing point of view, is that funding individually and eliminating any one of these could almost break the systemic contribution and chain of that transformative transition agenda. So we need to think through finance from a portfolio effect so that it's not viewed in isolation. So a banker couldn't, for example, say, oh, well, the renewable energy project is particularly exciting. Let me cherry pick that one and forget about the others. But if you do, you basically undermine the quality of the entire portfolio, and so undermine the quality of the entire just transition effect. Then I went and looked at the financial instruments available in South Africa to basically meet these needs. And in that context, what was fascinating for me was, do we have the instruments that can help support the range of projects that might be supportive of a just transition outcome? And in my view, we have a very sophisticated financial sector. We have deep pockets, and that's evident in the renewable energy program, which was funded in South Africa. Also, there's a high level of awareness of sustainability and climate change since the Global Compact from 2000. And many of the South African financial institutions have climate and sustainability related conventions they've signed up for, the Equator Principles and all of that. So it's quite fascinating and interesting in terms of Nicole's finding about the right tools and the pipelines and the dimensions, that despite all these years of sustainability focused issues, in 2021, we are still hearing the kind of comments from not just the South African banking sector, but globally, that we might not have the right tools. So it does beg the question, what were we doing for the last 20 years plus, actually since the Brundtland Commission? Because these issues are actually not fundamentally new. The S part of the ESG, environmental and social governance, surely considered these dimensions. South Africa is also unique in that we have some track record on financing a political transition, and we have understood the renewable energy market and the trade-offs that are there. Even though it wasn't designed as a transition program, it certainly brought in a new dimension requiring new skills and new aspects in terms from a banking framework point of view. And to Nicole's last point, there's no reason why the banks can't just start now, and they probably fully appreciate that, which is encouraging. So in terms of the suite of sustainable finance instruments we have available, almost all of those that are being used elsewhere is already in use in South Africa. Some of them growing in scale, others that are still can grow in scale, like social bonds, for example. and then aspects of without additional regulation. So I think one of the key challenges we do have is a structural one, that we not really have a financial system that's built for inclusivity and equity at the moment. It's actually still biased largely towards larger businesses. So I have 2 more slides. I see, Saul, I'm sure I have to wrap up shortly, but the two slides speaks to the project need. And the one is just where I scale it, there's an aspect of looking at the systemic effect of transitions, trying to design interventions, understanding that projects are interdependent. You can't actually break them up artificially or cherry pick them. There's a sequencing that needs to happen. So we need financing arrangements that speak to this dimension. In the last slide, I thought that it would be valuable, and there's a lot more in the paper, so I do encourage you to read the paper. But for the roadmap, and it's really exciting what you're developing, the 2050 vision. But for me, there's 2 key questions also that we need to answer, which would be, under what conditions is funding currently being made available in South Africa? And what is informing the conditions of that funding? And that's both international and national dimensions. And so in terms of the area of work, I've just picked out a few that really stand out from the paper for me that I wanted to emphasize. So on policy and regulation, we certainly have a lot of really valuable policies, far more than most countries actually have from a developing country point of view. But there is need to integrate more, shift away from voluntary and move more to mandatory, and also recognize greater the social stability factors as an investment dimension. And also about framing the scale of the challenge relative, to the scale of response required from the finance sector. At an instrument level, one of the biggest things for me is we need to improve the capital structure of South Africa's development finance system. We can't have, largely issuing bonds in the same way that the banks are issuing bonds. We need a greater allocation from government to support the capital structure of DFIs so they can act more as DFIs in the areas of where things are more difficult to finance relative to others. On institutions, 2 things I want to point out: that the incentives and origination capabilities at the level of funders really needs to be relooked at. So when I say incentives is as somebody going out to look for a deal, what is driving their vision of how they find deals? Because if they say there is enough money and no pipeline, those that have pipeline will say there's enough pipeline and no money. So why are they mismatched? And the other point on institutions is that there is no big fund that's going to fix this. We need the entire financial system of South Africa to have a sensitization about financing the just transition and embedding it in the same way that we did with BEE. This is a broad systemic issue. And even the 8.5 billion that's coming will come under certain conditions, possibly handcuffs, possibly prerequisites that will have a reverberation effect. And maybe lastly, on disclosure and monitoring, it would be wonderful if the roadmap can start helping to unpick, the aspects around 2 things: the consistency and transparency. And lastly, about it's not just what individual financial actors do to contribute, but it's how do they complement each other to create that shift in the financial system more broadly. Thank you, Saul. Back to you.
Thanks very much, Chantel. I really like that last slide of yours, because I think it really captures some of the key issues that we need to focus in terms of work areas: the policy and regulation, the instruments, the institutions, and the disclosures and monitoring. I think that neatly captures the way we need to break up these things and focus our energy. So I'm looking forward to more work on this and trying to unpack each one of those areas so that we move in the right direction. We're now going to move over to our last speaker, it's Fumani Mtembu from Knowledge Pele, and she's going to be talking about scaling up the community projects. We've had quite a bit of discussion on, is there a pipeline, isn't there a pipeline, and how do we think about the pipeline of projects? In our work, we definitely found a pipeline. There are projects out there, and one of the key challenges, as Sandy has noted, is that when they're small, what kind of impact do they make? But what we did see in our initial testing of the water, is that many of these projects can be scaled up. There's potential there to move across community. There's potential to have projects grow in size. And we then asked Fumani to start unpacking some of that thinking so that we can take a more in-depth understanding of how we go about scaling up community projects. So over to you, Fumani.
Hi, Saul, and hi, everyone. Thanks so much for the platform. So as you've rightly said, my focus was on scaling just transition projects from the perspective of community projects. And, you know, in a sense, I think my paper had to balance both empirical experiences as well as sort of the theory or the normative perspectives that exist around, you know, community projects. Initially, the paper does open with a consideration of some of the more, I'd say, critical questions around, you know, what we mean when we talk about scaling a just transition in the context of South Africa, which is a country that is in any event in, you know, some kind of process of transition. You know, we've gone from a formal transition to perhaps a more sort of transformation kind of project. And so I sort of weave some of those ideas into it just to, you know, indicate that it's not a completely new question to the extent that we're considering, you know, how this, you know, South African society and economy moves forward in a manner that is inclusive, just, and addresses all the, you know, historical challenges that we've had. And so, you know, the just transition is almost yet another layer to add to what is an existing process of transition in the country. Having said that, and you know, I won't delve too much into the sort of more secondary research that was done. But the key thing that, you know, I needed to unpick around community project was, you know, what makes a community project work and you know, typically, you know, what drives failure. And what was coming through from, you know, case studies outside of the empirical or, you know, primary research that I did was that a lot of community projects in general, so not specific to the just transition, sort of suffer problems of sustainability because the norms around community development, you know, or let me say the more progressive understanding of good community development is that, you know, it's participatory and ultimately is about, you know, ensuring that communities sort of take ownership of projects, and very often that becomes the most difficult thing to achieve. Because, you know, you have, let's call them project developers or project initiators that are not necessarily of the communities. And, you know, they'll establish a project in a community, and then once it's time to exit, there are challenges around, you know, how to do that and how to do that sustainably. And, you know, one of the findings, and I'll come back to it at the end, is that perhaps there's a requirement to think in a slightly different way around what we understand to be the long-term sustainability of a community project. And perhaps, you know, just take a step back, you know, the community in this context particularly is about, you know, communities that are, you know, less privileged or underdeveloped. And so, you know, township, peri-urban, rural communities in South Africa. And in appreciating that we must absolutely have work occur in those communities and projects support those communities, there is still, I think, a requirement to also shift our normative understanding of what success looks like at that. So I'm not saying at the end, but at the point at which the community is integrated into a project. And I think there's a requirement to perhaps, you know, take the lessons of history more seriously and not be so heavy-handed about some of our norms, recognizing that, you know, community projects aren't different in terms of the basic fundamentals from any other kind of project. And so one would ask the question, you know, if you established a large, let's say a large renewable energy power plant, would you hand it over to a completely new owner within a short period of time. And so if the answer to that is no, then the question is, why are we so invested when it comes to community projects? And do we recognize that the history and the case studies indicate to us that typically that is not a successful approach? And so it's a bit difficult, I think, as a thing to sort of wrap one's head around, because of the norms that exist in the literature, and certainly for myself as a development professional, it is something that I'm also contending with, just appreciating that, there are complexities in transferring projects. And often that becomes what kills projects that are incredibly important to communities, and then also I think to proving the case for much larger projects that are ultimately implemented. So these are just some of the more sort of background considerations, but I want to get into the empirical research because a lot of the findings really come out of the experiences of these different projects that were assessed for the purpose of the paper. And I looked at projects established both in South Africa and outside of South Africa and across sectors, although there was a bias towards clean energy projects. So, microgrids and sort of microgrids and, rooftop projects established in underprivileged communities. And based on these interviews, as well as interviews with financiers, I was then able to sort of pick out key learnings. So in terms of key findings then, one of the things that I found quite energizing about the projects that I was evaluating is that often, we think of community projects in a manner that is sort of disconnected from larger scale projects or from macroeconomic objectives. And very often I was finding that, the parties initiating these projects had scale in mind and understood these projects almost as small scale versions of what the larger scale version of these projects might be. And so one of the findings is that the project often existed at the regulatory limit, meaning that they were kind of testing the boundaries of how far one could go, whether it's in establishing a microgrid at, the maximum scale that is permitted by regulation. Often the work was actually very experimental and seeking to establish the case for much larger scale projects in future. And so I thought that was an important thing to appreciate, because if we start to understand what these projects are really aiming to do, which I think particularly because they occur within a community context, the appreciation of what they're attempting to do ought to go beyond, perhaps resolving a livelihoods dilemma or poverty problem within a community. But once you appreciate that they're actually solving for potentially the future of a particular sector or technology class, then we start to see them as key sites of innovation. And in seeing them as key sites of innovation, I think it also then speaks to a very different kind of funding approach, very often quite different from the way in which these projects are typically funded. So as I've said, potential for scale sits at that regulatory limit, and often these projects are operating at that limit. The next thing that became apparent is that public-private partnerships are essential even at the level of community projects. So as I say, in tandem with the imperative for regulatory change is the sort of pervasive and very necessary role of the state. The projects that were evaluated were very often either directly working with the state or in conversation with the state and seeking state support, because there is still a requirement very often to subsidize key aspects of what these projects are attempting to do. And if you go to the what it means to operate at the regulatory limit, often these projects are challenging regulation or seeking to sort of move regulation and or policy in a certain direction. And that's not something that can happen in isolation. And a lot of the project initiators were very conscious of that. You know, they were saying, you know, in order for these projects to actually achieve scale and to have impact and meaning beyond sort of the single site that has been established, it's important that we have you know, proper partnership and collaboration with the state, you know, and the issues range from perhaps needing to access more land, all the way to, as I've said, you know, changing a piece of legislation. But the important point is that a lot of what needs to be done as it pertains to scaling these projects requires the state to be involved, and to be involved at quite an early stage. Of course, these projects, you know, I think like most things, they don't exist outside of historical context, and therefore past politics remain very much within their present context. And these are, you know, in interviewing the, you know, the various actors within these projects, it became so apparent that a lot of what, you know, these project developers are doing is sort of clearing the ground for a much smoother operational context once scale is achieved. And so very often, you know, they have to deal with a lot of, you know, pre-existing politics, you know, whether it's politics at the community level or, you know, at a slightly higher level. And that work of you know, brokering relationships, or, you know, reorganizing the ways in which relationships are structured in communities, and, you know, the ways in which relationships are or let me say sort of political arrangements are structured, even going beyond the community. That is a very big component of what these projects typically encounter. And the work is undertaken not because, you know, they're seeking to solve for sort of a limited or sort of short-term problem in relation to the project, but because often the founders recognize that there's a bigger context that they're solving for. And so, you know, in pushing for perhaps a change in regulation, and pushing for a different kind of sort of, I mean, I use the term political, but, you know, different kind of political understanding of the project, you know, whether it is, you know, who can access opportunity in relation to jobs and or the benefits of the project. But in trying to reconfigure all those relationships, ultimately what these project founders are trying to do is make it possible for, you know, the sort of a model for scale to be executed with much greater ease in future. And I speak about this because one of the, you know, the key findings is really about all these pieces of unremunerated work that go into small scale projects that are happening at community level, and actually are important for the scalability of these projects and the technologies that are related to them. And so it's just something important to keep in mind. And I think it's also about sort of shifting our perspective on how we understand, you know, what a community project really is, and what it ought to solve, and appreciating that there's actually a lot of innovation that's happening at that level. And there is sort of a beauty and value in the fact that there can be this high level of innovation happening within a community context, but that has implications for the macro context from a scale perspective. So the unremunerated work does then have an impact ultimately on the quality and sustainability of the project, and it's something that speaks to how we understand the funding of the project. So it just was something that I picked up and I thought was important to surface, because it sort of intersects with, one, how the projects are themselves managed, and then ultimately how they can be scaled. Another, of course, quite important aspects of this, and I think it cuts across you know, all projects, is the sort of place of time. You know, so we know that there's urgency around the just transition, and yet there's certain things that are difficult to achieve as a function of time. And so, you know, I speak about, and this is just one example, you know, in one case, it took 4 years to develop a microgrid, which typically is something that can happen from, you know, in terms of establishing the project in 8 days. And so, it takes 4 years to ultimately achieve something that could have been done over, a 10-day or 2-week period max, precisely because of all the pre-work that needs to go into it. And so, the time dilemma, I think, is one we all have to contend with, recognizing that there's a very urgent problem. I think Saul, you said, earlier on that, the planet's going to burn. And we recognize that we have that kind of urgency, and yet at the same time, time is a constraint. And, even at that sort of very small community scale, the work of getting to a point where the ground is truly cleared and ready for a project can be very time consuming. And again, is one of those things that from a funding perspective needs to be appreciated. Things take time. And so, if you appreciate what the project ultimately seeks to achieve, then you can fund it in a way that accounts for some of these sort of stickier elements that constitute the project development phase. And then I, picked up, as I've said, in looking at all these different things, whether it's pushing for regulatory change, brokering, different, political arrangements, dealing with time as a very real variable, particularly, time also impacts, communities that are geographically quite difficult to access. And so, that can also sort of stretch out how long a project needs to take just to be established, what it takes to maintain relations, etc. But all these aspects of what went into projects, when asked, I found that, the project developers couldn't really finance or all these things, so they kind of assumed those costs, and when I say assume them, almost internalize them. So either ran their projects at a sort of a cost to them. So in other words, financially the project stops making sense at some point, or individuals, if able to, are then taking on some of these costs. And what became clear is that, the smaller scale the project, and within a community context, the more feminized it is. And I use that term in the context of, feminist economics to say there is a lot of unremunerated and unrecognized labor that goes on, that goes into these projects, unfunded, because there's an ultimate failure to appreciate what these projects are contributing to what then becomes possible from a scale perspective. And so, this is something that definitely came through quite strongly. So I saw, am I out of time?
You almost out of time. I don't know if you want to wrap up in the next minute or two. That would be great.
Okay, absolutely. And so then looking at it from a funding perspective, I mean, of course, there's never enough money. And so, again, the message here, and this goes back to the importance of the state, the message here is really about the importance of genuine development finance. And I think in South Africa, we have a challenge with that, development finance that appreciates innovation challenges and then also is able to sort of match that ambition with patient capital. And then the challenge is the talk of impact. So, in the earlier presentation, Chantal spoke about ESG. There's a new sort of impetus around the importance of impactful funding. But when interviewing financiers who are raising capital for just transition projects, they said often they're under pressure to present impact narratives. But in reality, our financiers are still quite uncreative, very mainstream in the way that they view the world, and really quite profit driven. That again, profit being a very narrow understanding of, I would say, the time value of money, because there's a misunderstanding of what it means to invest today in society and the environment, and what that would ultimately yield in terms of financial benefit in the long run. So I think the final thing maybe that I want to emphasize is that, in scaling just transition projects, there is an importance in shifting how we think about key things. And one of those things is community. We know that these projects have a place in communities, but I think that we need to think, perhaps shift our thinking from community-based projects, which comes with a lot of these normative ideas around community ownership, towards perhaps community-placed projects, which can be sort of shared partnership model type projects, but where we don't place projects under extreme pressure to have their founders exit, and then ultimately, creating failures where a lot of good work has been done. So I'll leave it there. Thanks all.
Thanks very much, Fumani. I think that gives us a lot of insights, and there are a number of challenges to overcome. I think scaling up these projects is not going to be easy, and it means that we're going to need to think about creative solutions to how we get these projects financed and scaled up. What we'll do is, if I can ask all the panelists to take off their, put on their camera, and then just open it up for some questions. If people want to raise their hands, you can just click on the reactions button at the bottom and then click on raise hand, and then I can allow you a chance to ask a question. Okay, we've got one in the chat, which we can already start off with. Sandy, there's a question from Todd, who's asking for an example of from your study of what is a cluster 1 project and a cluster 4 project that needs finance. Over to you, Sandy.
Okay, thanks for the question, Todd. The cluster 1 projects are all projects that have been articulated by Eskom that are in the public domain. We are aware of other Eskom projects, but they're not in the public domain, so they're not in the sample. Those 3 projects there are the projects that Eskom went out on call for in terms of repurposing and repowering the 3 Mpumalanga-based coal-fired power stations. So that's that. And then an example of cluster 4 projects is those projects are actually all a single project. I've called it the Unicorn Project because we've signed an NDA, so I can't make the details public yet, but it's a project which is run by a mining house. The aim of the project is to transfer land owned by the mining house to the community once the mines are closed down, to link that with a water project which will increase access to water, and that will create the ability to restart an indigenous agriculture project, which will be commercially viable and which offtake agreements have already been negotiated for. The project also has aspects related to upskilling the communities and making sure that there are enough auxiliary services and projects to support the main project. So those are 2 examples of 1 and 4.
Thanks very much, Sandy. And there will be more that are elaborated in the paper when we do release it. There is a working paper on the TIPS website which does unpack some of that. There's a next question for Fumani, and that's from Ntabi. She asks if you can elaborate on what you mean by feminization of projects in the context of non-remuneration for project work. Over to you.
Sure. Okay. All right. So what I was referencing is the fact that there's a lot. So when we talk about feminization of work, we're talking about unremunerated work often, right? So, for example, the labor of women, whether the work that's done at home, etc., is often not recognized in the economy. It's not accounted for. And that's how women end up working so much harder than men from a total time perspective. And what I recognized in these small scale projects at the community level was a similar thing, where a lot of work is actually being done that clears the ground for work that is possible at scale. So if, for example, microgrids don't exist in a society, And, you start, let's say in South Africa, the most recent example is that, until recently, we didn't have that 100 megawatt dispensation allowing embedded generation. And so you have developers who've been working right at the regulatory limit, building projects that are under 10 megawatts, and with very little support. And of course, at 10 megawatts, you don't have huge mining clients. And so you're doing the political work, you're advocating, you're lobbying, you're demonstrating through the project that this is effective and it works. Once the regulatory limit is increased, there's no sort of development fee that comes back to you. So there's a lot of work that happens because people are passionate advocates of work that needs to happen within a certain sector, but they're not remunerated when scale is possible. And that's really what I meant. Like I said, it's changing regulation, politics, etc.
Thanks, Fumani. I mean, I think these are broader societal issues that seem to come through quite strongly, as do many of the issues of the just transition, particularly when we're looking at issues of inequality and poverty in the impacted communities. There's a question that's come up from Garth Barnes, who's asking Nicole, can you give us a sense of the spread of financiers you surveyed, and if there were any that could offer financing in the range 500,000 to 2 million, which is quite low scale financing?
Yeah, sure. So just to make it quick, we definitely spoke to a range of financiers, everything from commercial banks to institutional investors to DFIs. And while there were one or two sort of private equity investors who might look at something like that through a specified sort of impact fund, the bulk of them were saying, the general narrative was, don't come to me with a request for 50 million, I want to finance 500 million. So it was, that kind of big scale is what they were looking for, which is part of the problem, is that they have this thing in their heads that the only kind of just transition project is a mega project. So that is one of the problems, is those small projects. I think that speaks very clearly to Sandy's quadrants.
Thanks. And it points to some of the solutions that we need to be thinking around. We've had some engagement with colleagues from India who've spoken about a Grameen Bank type option of microfinance. We have a microfinance sector in South Africa, but how does it play out in terms of the pricing of the microfinance and the availability of it? And it's something that we're going to need to think about. But also when we've been looking at projects, when we're talking about small scale, we've been talking about less than 50 million, which for many, that's a small to medium sized company. So it's not just the very low end of projects. We're also looking at the challenges of those projects that are in our context, small to medium size. I've got two hands that are up. I'm going to take Claude first, and then we'll go to Riaz. Claude?
Hi, thanks. It's something I've brought up previously, and I just wondered if any of you have looked at it. I'm currently working on a model for community ownership of a large solar farm by virtue of the community being granted bonds through the normal banking system, and then using those bonds to invest in a green bond in the IPP project, as it were. And the IPP project will actually be owned and managed by the local municipality, the district municipality. So it'll be feeding electricity to local municipalities, owned by the district municipality, but it'll actually be owned by the people of the district. And it's an interesting model. I've engaged with pension funds and banks, and there is interest. There's just some uncertainty about unlocking the regulatory requirements within the MFMA and the PFMA and the rest of it. But I just wondered if that notion of community ownership of the debt, I call it, but I call it good debt ownership rather than bad debt ownership, has been looked at all as a mechanism for empowering a large number of people in actual ownership. Thank you.
Yes, thanks, Clyde. And I think that we do need to look at creative mechanisms. There's regulatory barriers on the finance side, but there's also regulatory barriers in other parts of our system that do create blockages. But there are also some mechanisms that we've seen in terms of risk mitigation. You know, we've we've written a little bit about it, and we didn't have a chance to discuss fully those risk mitigation measures. But one of them, for example, is a challenge fund, like we see with the jobs fund. There's no reason why we can't have a just transition challenge fund on a similar basis. So these are some of the strategies we've looked at that we can bring in terms of an institutional and product response that we are looking at. Let me go over then to Riaz. Riaz?
Hi, everybody. Thanks for the presentations. Unfortunately, I didn't quite catch some of the earlier ones, but I did get for money, and I asked for money in compliance with Papaya if we can potentially make contact. So I'm with the South African National Energy Development Institute, another state-owned entity looking at applied research, and we work with a number of universities and around the country looking at technology development and a whole lot of other stuff. And I'm really pleased to see that there's this whole little network looking at just transition, but I'm a little disappointed that no one, I don't recognize anyone on this call, yet, you know, we are working almost in parallel. So for example, Sanedi commissioned the University of Johannesburg to develop a sector development plan for the micro biogas or anaerobic digester technology. And that's a piece of work that they're currently involved in. And I don't think any of you are even aware of that, to see, you know, looking at biogas, what potential it could be, what's the appropriate market segment, and you know, how that could potentially be a particular role. And I'm happy to try and make the links. There's a workshop this week, Friday, just looking at stakeholders. And unfortunately, in those workshops, it's just the same familiar usual suspects. And I'd like to include some of these groups. Then, you know, with the University of KZN, Sanedi again, through the South African Research Chair in Waste and Climate Change, is developing or looking to develop the waste to energy roadmap, and looking at waste categorization. You all have service delivery issues we're aware of wherever you are in the country. And, you know, it's one of the actions or one of the ways, similar how you're trying to develop a roadmap here, to try and see what way and how we can bring these two worlds together. And, you know, these are just, I've got a lot more. I've got my own community projects, and I'm interested in, Fumani, when you say you did South African projects, I've done a number of projects around the country over the last couple of years. And, you know, we've got our own on the ground experience of challenges. And, you know, part of the questions that I want to ask is to say, you know, coming from a government perspective or a government state-owned entity perspective, for my personal experience, because I have a bit of private sector background as well, is the funding cycles, because it's a project, there's a start date and end date. So that for me is some of the restrictions in terms of when you talk of a project, how does it work? And sustainability and project, you know, and with the funding cycles from a government doesn't always work together. And apologies, the next part is apologies if it was covered earlier, but public employment programs, especially the expanded public works program or community works program, whichever version of it you're looking at. I've only seen most of Fumani's and bits of Chantal, but I don't know if there was any touch on that, because when we looked at designs for implementation, we looked at labor intensive under the former Working for Energy program at Sanedi to try and see what role that could play. And again, you know, I think, you know, we looked at it from a technology development going towards commercialization and looking at satisfying energy or alternative energy. But, you know, you have a different focus being the just energy transition, but there's so much overlap or so much lessons to be learned, but we're not asking the same, or we're doing something, but we're not looking at it from your perspective, or you're not looking at it from our perspective. And I just think that maybe we need to, and I need to close the gap a little more. And I need to thank my general manager, Barry Bredenkamp, who actually forwarded this invitation to say, you know, maybe this is one of the ways we need to have this. But I'll pause there, but I think there's definitely a lot more to be spoken of. And there's a lot more that's currently happening. It's just about getting these different networks. And you know, I mean, when we speak to renewable energy, Sanedi is fortunate in that we don't, we're technology agnostic. So we don't drive just one design or one technology, wind, solar, heat, you know, heat exchanges, everything we on. And we say, you need to work together. But I'm going to stop there because the seesaw is going to interrupt.
Yeah.
Yes.
Thanks, Riaz. I mean, I think that raises important points around connections. What I would like to do, because I think we've reached the end of our time limit and we are losing people from the call, is just ask all of our panelists to just give a 30-second closing remarks. And maybe Sandy, you can touch on the observatory as next steps in terms of what Riaz has raised around how we start bringing those connections and synergies. So let me start with Sandy, and then I'll go in order of the other presenters, Ed, Nicole, Chantel, and Fumani. Just a closing 30-second remark on this workshop, and then we'll bring it to a conclusion. Over to you, Sandy.
Thanks, Saul. I think, as Rudy said in the beginning, it's a tricky problem. In the literature, someone described it as a super wicked problem, which I think is more relevant. I think we're at the very beginning of the path of unpacking the issues and the interconnections that we need to make. And I think it's going to be a long journey that we need to collectively travel down this road. And we are planning to be able to take the work that we've done in the roadmap forward by setting up a Just Transition Finance Observatory, which will be a medium to long-term intervention aimed at making sure that we're having the right conversations with the right people and connecting the right dots. Thanks.
Thanks, Sandy. Ed?
Thanks, Saul. I think I'd just reiterate Sandy's point really about, the fact that, there's a big network. A lot of the work is around connecting people, joining the dots, as Riaz said, is there's and embracing a bigger diversity of sort of investment in just transition as possible.
Thanks, Ed. Nicole?
Yeah, thanks. I think, I think my closing remark is just that there is obviously a lot of work to do, but there is nothing stopping us from getting started. So I think the biggest danger we face at the moment is trying to lay a perfect foundation before we act. And so at this stage, it's get started with what we've got. As we go, we'll meet other partners and we'll collaborate and we'll build on what we're doing. But there's really no point to hesitate anymore. So if you're, regardless of what sector you're in, if you're in the project developer, the policymaker, or the financer side, just start. We're out of time.
Thanks, Nicole. Chantel?
Thank you. First of all, thank you for this chance again to engage and work with you and hear everyone's exciting interconnections. My closing remark would probably be that we must resist the temptation to try and reduce the financing of the just transition to a few simple nuggets and widgets and variables, because that, in trying to reduce it and oversimplify, we're going to lose the importance of the complexity and the reverberation of change. So even as Nicole is saying, let's not look for the perfect foundation before we start. Even as we start, we need to be able to expand ourselves, even as workers in this space, to hold that complexity constant, because there is, there's that tendency to try and be normative. And that's a challenge, because the magic is in the outliers.
Thanks, Chantel. I like that. Fumani?
Yeah, I mean, I think I share everyone's sentiments, and I think it's about being comprehensive. And I think of funding from a community project level. I think comprehensive funding needs to be how we think about it. And I think it's not just a challenge for financiers, but also project developers. There's a requirement to sort of step outside of or beyond traditional models of being development practitioners and think in slightly more commercial terms about what needs to be done and make a more aggressive case for what the work actually intends to do. And then, as I've said, I think the shift from community-based to community-placed can also help us overcome some of these sort of identity challenges that we have when we think of ourselves as outsiders in the context of communities that we have genuine intentions to work in and support and become a part of. So, I'd say those are my sort of two key ideas from the paper.
Great. Thanks very much. Thanks to all our panelists and to Rudy, who had to leave a bit earlier to another meeting. I think it's been a really engaging and useful discussion. I feel like we're moving forward. We've got a lot of good ideas, and we understand the gaps that need to be filled. It doesn't make filling the gaps easier, but I think the what Nicole was saying about let's just start, and then we find ways through the puzzle. You know, how we have an end state vision. We start doing the short-term interventions, and we start to find ways of how we can strengthen our finance system so that it does, as Chantal has said, become a system-wide change. You know, that finance institutions across the board are looking at products and suitable responses to this just transition. Thanks very much, everyone. And thank you to all the participants for joining in. And we look forward to seeing you at our next dialogue. Thanks very much, everyone. Have a good day. Bye.